Hello everyone, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture is on evaluation of virtue ethics. So last week we saw that virtue ethics can be defined as a system of ethics that focuses more on how we ought to be than on what we ought to do. And the emphasis then is on character development and developing habits through practice, practiced actions that become dispositions, so more natural kind of inclinations that you don't think about, which you don't think very much. You kind of just do by habit and routine. Um, and this eventually is supposed to develop our inner quality of being, character. It fulfills our natures, our telos, concept rooted in Aristotelian thought, in Aristotle's thinking that, again, everything has some kind of purpose or telos, right? So, in evaluating the system, we're going to look at a handful of arguments today. Um, the first one, the first criticism is that virtue ethics offers unclear guidance, or the guidance is not clear, is not precise, is imprecise. Okay. So, because it's a general approach to the study of character, the theory does not provide guidance in specific contexts, like moral dilemmas. Knowing that we should avoid self-serving flattery and envy does not tell us how to handle Kant's axe murderer case. For development of this criticism, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 58 to 59, and Giles and Matthews, 2020, page 35. Now, a related problem here is that the theory, apart from some guidance, does not appear to stand on its own. For example, both Kant and Mill made room for virtues in their different moral theories. Utilitarians would encourage those virtues that lead one to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people, and deontologists would also encourage virtues that tend to lead us to treat others as ends in themselves and not just as mere means to our ends. That kind of thing. So the system, the theory of virtue ethics is actually amenable to other theoretical frameworks and systems in metaethics. So it doesn't look like it stands on its own. Um, that's a related problem to this concern about ambiguity, that ethics is so general, virtues are so general that the guidance they provide is not always clear or precise or helpful then. Okay. So let's look at the second objection. This one is based on a concern with clashing virtues and recalls problems with ethical relativism, at which we looked earlier in the course. Virtue ethics has a hard time identifying moral virtues. Are these universal traits? The problem here is that different traits have different values across different cultures. Patriarchal societies value submissive women, whereas matriarchal ones do not. Virtue ethics ultimately leads to a type of moral relativism then. One's list of virtues is relative to one's culture. And since these lists change from one culture to the next, morality seems to change from one culture to the next too. For more discussion of this problem, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, page 59, and Giles and Matthews, 2020, page 35 to 36. So the virtue ethics response is that people can use practical wisdom to identify common virtues. Okay, so there's an objection and a response that I've noted on this problem about relativism, that virtue ethics leads to relativism. Okay, this means then that the problems that beset ethical relativism will apply mutatis mutandis, with all the necessary changes then as needed, to virtue ethics as well. Not many changes will be needed. So this is the concern. Okay. So let's look at the third problem then that scholars and ethicists have raised in evaluating virtue ethics. This one is called the problem of circularity. Okay. Virtue ethics appears unhelpfully circular because Aristotle holds that an act is virtuous if it is an act that a virtuous person would commit in that circumstance. A person is virtuous when they act in virtuous ways. So the reasoning is just uninformative because it defines virtuous acts in terms of virtuous people, but virtuous people are defined in terms of virtuous acts. So it's not particularly enlightening about ethics. Okay? So one response is that circularity is not dangerous or problematic in this case because some apparently circular reasoning is harmless but still informative. Okay, an example here is a great piano player is what pianists playing great piano is what great pianists do. A pianist is great when he does great piano playing, or when she does great piano playing. So if you look at those two statements, the idea is that great piano players have skills to perform great music on the piano, even if they do not always do so. They may choose when to perform and not perform. Similarly, the virtuous person can recognize which acts are virtuous or not and perform well. Okay, so when commenting on the skill of playing piano greatly, we might say of a great piano player that they're good at their job or something like that, and that can seem circular or uninformative in telling us what a great piano player is. But that when it comes to the practice, there's still something going on. Right? So when the piano player plays greatly, we can observe that and tell that's great playing versus bad playing. So the response here is that even though when we say virtuous people act virtuously and make a circular kind of statement, we're still trying to say, well, there's still an action that we see as different from this type of action. Being kind and patient with people is as an observation is a sharp contrast to someone who's very short-tempered and impatient with people, and we can see a qualitative difference there. That's the idea. So the circularity can be harmless, but still informative in that we say something about the different qualities of these different actions that we can observe. So that's one objection based on circularity and a response too. So let's look at, for more discussion of that exchange, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 59 to 60. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth objection then. And this is a problem with the way virtue ethics contributes to the ideal state of being, or Aristotle's eudaimonia. So the problem here is qualifying the degree to which a virtue must be held in order to make it moral, or for it to make a moral contribution to our achieving that ideal state, eudaimonia. Just how much courage does someone need to be considered morally courageous? These amounts are never explicitly identified. Is it 75% courage to be morally courageous? Remember, too much courage leads to foolhardiness, where you might rush in to stop a gunman in the scene of a crime hastily, and you could be just shot to death instantly. You're not helping anybody, right? So too much courage can be bad. You have the excess, and then remember with the deficit, cowardliness, you have too little courage. So the golden mean, then the idea of someone who is courageous is identified, but then it's not clear just in this continuum between deficiency, mean, and excess, where the courageous actions become morally contribute morally to our becoming virtuous people and reaching eudaimonia. We're not sure just how much courage we need. Then is the problem, right? And so, uh, since that quantity isn't identified or defined in Aristotle's list of virtues or in any list of virtues, the problem arises in trying to determine how much virtue then we need to contribute in these act types with these actions to become the ideal, to achieve the ideal state of human existence, or Aristotle's happiness, eudaimonia. Okay, so for more discussion of that objection, see Dimmock on Fisher, 2017, pages 60 to 61. Okay, so now let's look at the fifth objection or concern, problem that ethicists raise with virtue ethics. And this one is a concern that right action is not a matter of degree. We just talked about the continuum, so keep that in mind. Okay. So Kant argues that living morally, Kant now is arguing, he's criticizing Aristotle's theory here. He says, living morally is not a matter of degree, as Aristotle explains. Something is either praiseworthy or not 50% praiseworthy and then 50% not praiseworthy. So it makes no sense to say that moral judgment or virtue is a mean between two vices, excess, deficiency, and excess, right? So for this argument, see Kant, Doctrine of Virtue and Metaphysics of Morals. This mechanism, this idea of a continuum then and a degree of virtue, distracts us from the real reason why a virtue is considered good in the first place. Kant asks, do we really think of moral behavior in this way? Are we really thinking about quantities of virtue when we behave virtuously? So there's a concern there that virtuous actions then are not something that can be quantified as 75% courageous or not. They're just virtuous or they're not, or they're moral or they're not, and that's what Kant's thinking. You can't divide moral action up that way so that an action is 35% right and the remainder wrong or whatnot. It's right or wrong, and virtue ethics on this continuum makes it a matter of degree or percentage. So there's a concern there. Another objection that with which I want to close that I don't list in the guidance in the written lecture is a concern with the is-ought problem. Remember Hume's is-ought problem. His concern was that his idea was that morality cannot be grounded in nature or natural properties. To remind you, we can use the example about animals practicing incest in the wild. We may observe that animals do this factually, but that doesn't give us any reason to draw a moral judgment that we should behave in a similar manner, right? So Hume's argument is that we can't ground moral properties in natural properties based on observations of natural facts. This is where Hume's guillotine comes into discussion. He makes a sharp distinction between facts and values, and that distinction is questionable because it's too neat. It looks too neat, and it leads to a really heavy-handed argument against ethics, against different ethical theories. What Hume is saying is that ethics cannot be grounded in moral properties, but he also thinks they cannot be grounded in natural properties, but he also thinks they cannot be grounded in non-natural properties. So Hume thinks moral properties cannot be natural or non-natural. But those are the only kinds they could be. That's an exhaustive category by the law of excluded middle in logic. A or not A. Well, then that's not A is everything else then, right? So what Hume is saying is that there are no moral properties. He thinks that morality is just emotional responses. And that is a very weak position. It just does not track with our judgments about morality. Child molestation is not something that we say yuck to. Okay, murder is not just something that we say ugh to. Okay, so most ethicists do not agree with Hume's position. His theory is called emotivism, and we'll look more at that critically when we look at metaethics later in the course. Okay, but I noted here that Hume's argument from the is-ought problem can be turned against virtue ethics, because what it says is, hey, you can't use the natural state of human being, their telos, to say what should or should not be done. That just runs into the is-ought problem again, right? So we see yet another example or case, a theory where Hume's is-ought problem can be to which Hume's is-ought problem can be applied. And this is part of the concern with Hume's argument. It's so general and it's too strong. It covers too much. You can reject utilitarianism because it grounds moral properties in pleasure and pain, and those are natural properties. So just because they're natural properties, you can reject utilitarianism. You can reject virtue ethics because it grounds moral properties in character, natural traits of character, and our natures tell us. You can do the same with rights ethics, natural law. So Hume's argument is just so strong. It says it says no to all these theories with just a simple wave of the hand. When in fact, the analogies at which we look to make Hume's argument look selective or arbitrary. We can find cases in nature that with which we might respond negatively, and that's Hume's idea. But we can also find examples from nature and observations where the conclusions are positive. Okay, and we still seem to recognize a moral distinction between human beings and, in some cases, and some other relata. All right, so if we were stranded on a raft and we had to decide that we had to throw some weight overboard to survive, and we had to decide whether we threw our friend's daughter Sally, who's 6, overboard, or a rooster we happen to have, we would naturally throw the rooster over the raft and wouldn't even consider throwing Sally overboard. But Hume says, nope, you can't do that, right? There's no moral ground to do that in nature anyways, or in any natural properties. But it seems that there's something about Sally's being as a human being that is significant. And so something natural that says, yeah, we shouldn't throw Sally overboard. The rooster can go. Okay, so Hume's argument seems just too strong, and it's selective in its cases. We could also and we can also draw attention to the observations we make about other primates and how they care for their young and each other. That tells us something positive about how we should also care for our young as primates as well. So there are some positive observations we can make and draw correlations for normative human behavior. All right, and we can still recognize the significance of human beings in making moral judgments. In a way, even if it's not precisely clear to us, it's still clear enough to say, hey, there's something wrong with Hume's argument here. It seems really too strong. And this is actually where most ethicists are probably, this is a position to which most ethicists are coming today. And we'll look at these, at that issue more, Hume's emotivism and metaethics, and this is-ought problem and the naturalistic fallacy. We'll look at that specifically when we look at metaethics later in the course. So I mentioned the material here because you can raise this objection against virtue ethics from the is-ought problem. Okay, and I've also noted a response. This is a similar objection response we've looked at as we looked at some of the other theories, because Hume's argument is very general and applies to so many different theories. We've considered it as it's arisen in discussion of the different theories. Okay, so I wanted to mention it here in discussion of virtue ethics as a closing objection, and then I also noted a response. So if you have any questions about the arguments or the material this week on evaluation of virtue ethics, or the arguments against virtue ethics, the responses in defense of virtue ethics, please feel free to send me an email or stop in on office hours or chime in discussion forum, and I'm happy to provide guidance and further information on the subject. Okay, so thank you for joining me today, and I will see you all in the next lecture. Bye-bye.